don't use this very much. Hello? Yes, can you hear me? Okay, I think we're going to start right now for this very exciting panel on gay tourism, Gully Queens, and the DL. Our first speaker is Mikey Stevens from Binghamton University, where he's doing a PhD in sociology.
Correct.
And the title of his talk today is The Gully as Exile and Refugee, Jamaican LGBT Youth and the Neoliberal Turn. You have a slideshow?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, my work is conceptualizing mechanisms of escape in the context of eligible LGBT communities. I seek to go beyond the constraints of James C. Scott's and we are not getting governed, and theorizing how communities are able to escape the capitalist world system in the neoliberal era. Integrated into this discussion is Parker's work on the fractionalization of modern LGBT identities, discussing the growing precarity of labor, growing precarity of queer persons of color, the working class, and poor nations. He examines how this is intensified for the neoliberal turn for the benefit of those homonormative gay and lesbians that have thrived under late capitalism and assimilated legislations of civil and political equality in the West. I argue that Jamaica's Gully Queens, a community of queer youths occupying the drainage ditch or the gully in Kingston, is representative of the growing precarity of these non-homonormative persons. Furthermore, occupying public space, I argue that the recreation of community in the gully is a mechanism of structural escape, which opens up possibilities for theorizing community against the state in the contemporary epoch. Some of my theoretical framework, of course, is James C. Scott. He addresses the relationship of early Southeast Asian states with eligible or ungoverned Hill peoples as the precursor for modern state making. The author examines how the Hill peoples of the Zomia region interactively refused incorporation into burgeoning state structures through strategies of escape. Such mechanisms centered around geographical mobility away from state valley centers into inhospitable elevations and climes, referred to as versions of distance. Counter to the legibility mechanisms, such as census taking and taxing mechanisms, that centered around measurable monocultures, ethnicities, households, and languages, Hill peoples created distance from the state through what are known as shadow zones, altering their social structure, customs, and subsistence patterns. These variances involved a bewildering heterogeneous mosaic of agriculture, ethnicities, religion, and language that even within the level of a family could change within a generation. His ultimate weakness, though, is failing to theorize on possibilities of refusal from the state within the modern era. He characterizes Zomia as the last great enclosure, arguing that the role of distance demolishing technologies and military sovereign ambitions has shored up incorporating all remaining shadow zones of the world. Ruling out the possibility for theorizing, of course, on modern-day Hill peoples. Yet Lefebvre discusses, Henri Lefebvre discusses modern refusals to state control and the conception of autogestion. Writing within the concept of 1970s state socialism in Western Europe, he criticizes the foreclosure of radical means of Marxist revolution and democratic organization in favor of more state-oriented forms. He criticizes these reformist socialisms for their primacy on what's known as the state mode of production. He argues that dominant Marxist movements have fixated on the state as the vehicle for change, predicated on an SMP, state mode of production, that directs the promotion and management of capitalist industrial growth and through which state redistribution occurs. What results is a co-management of social relations between state and capital. Rather than a withering away of the state, SMP leads to economic and technological growth without real social development, leaving stagnant numerous sectors of social reality. His alternative in autogestion or self-management is a refusal of the state in democratic organization. As the true practice of freedom, autogestion is a means for the reorganization of society which transforms it from bottom to top, from everyday life to the state. This involves a demonstration of mass participatory democracy that seeks to resolve the totality of the state capital system through mass action and refusal Although he states that there's a particular historical conjuncture that places the contradictions of capitalist society to its dialectical endpoint via Marx. That makes this possible. The process itself is always tenuous and in danger of being co-opted into the state. Yet it requires a privileged space in some weak point of the structure where society can disrupt the social edifice, transforming these cracks into strong points and absorbing those negating forces of the co-management of state and capital. While writing before the dramatic shifts of the neoliberal turn, Lefebvre, his work is contextually developed by the word Brenner. Neoliberalism, of course, involved the transition in the late 70s and 80s of state processes that secure institutional frameworks based on strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade ensured by the military, defense, police, and legal structures and functions to secure those rights. On the surface, it appears that Lefebvre's critique of S&P becomes inapplicable in the neoliberal context as much as the state's capacity for social redistribution has been gutted. Brenner, however, argues that the possibility of autogestion and a critique of S&P is more appropriate than ever. While it is true that mechanisms for redistribution evolved but withered away, the commodification of territory through S&P has intensified to an unprecedented scale under neoliberalism. The author claims that corporate capital's power, fiscal austerity, and social polarization is being extended onto a global scale through initiatives of autocratic international institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, and WTO. Thus, not only has S&P become more extensive and intensive, but radical calls for democracy beyond autogestion too call for movements at multiple scales. Wendy Brown provides a critique of the tenuous nature of democratic movements via identity politics and their proneness to co-optation and reabsorption into the state. She argues that such identities are an alternative manifestation of class politics characteristic of late capitalism, and that radicalization of such movements become hindered due to their interaction with liberal bureaucratic regimes. As Brown claims, de-radicalization is a symptomatic feature of politicized identity's desire within liberal bureaucratic regimes. Its foreclosure of its own freedom, its impulse to inscribing the law in another political registers its historical and present pain rather than conjure an imagined future power to make itself. This propagates an institutionalization of such identities into the regime where its resentment from Nietzsche or suffering itself becomes institutionalized, where it converts its reasoning into an ethnicizing politics, makes claims for itself only by entrenching, restating, dramatizing, and describing its pain to the politics. It can hold out no future that triumphs over this pain. Therefore, related to Lefebvre's conception of S&P, the author reinscribes a critique towards contemporary identity politics that recognizes that engaging with and working within the state can actually produce anticipatory futures. So this brings me to Krupchek and O'Hearn, who look at the possibility of exilic space building off contemporaries like Scott on communities of refusal, speaking to Brenner's argument of state power as increasing in scale and scope under the neoliberal period. One could actually read this as a restructured state capital regime of overextension of structures of domination, producing cracks for alternatives to neoliberal capitalism that exist and flourish. Krupchek and O'Hearn's concept of exilic spaces helps to theorize on such possibilities, looking at these as places where groups of people gather and escape or forced exile from state control and the processes of capitalist accumulation. The authors argue that contemporarily there are possibilities for both spatial and structural forms of escape, while the spatial form is reminiscent of Scott's construction of geographic removal. The formulation of structural escape becomes particularly important in dealing with those cracks within the social structure and an increasing entrenchment and proliferation of commodified space. Structural escape involves these people in communities that work, produce, and trade in the capitalist economy, but spend parts of their lives doing activities that are not fully incorporated within it. For this case of structural escape, Krupchek and O'Hearn also integrate the concept of infrapolitics, or those forms of place-based politics within the cracks of the global capitalist system. These involve the differentiation of refusals and resistances that occur within local cracks and are symptomatic of interconnected resistances within the global system. These possibilities of structural escape as exilic warrant a theoretical examination of such claims in relation to idyllic means, which I'll argue, void of participating in identity politics themselves. They actually recreate community of structural exile and refusal to the state. This is inextricably intertwined, of course, with the process of neoliberal capitalist restructuration of the global economy that, while having commodified territory, which Jamaica has created cracks, structural cracks. And the other strand of theory that I'm working with is this concept of the historical creation of modern gay lesbian identity. as intertwined with industrial capitalism. While homosexuality and gender fluid identity practices have existed globally throughout human history, modern day lesbian identity emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the industrializing West, coeval with social changes associated with the forest economy. Yet the fractionalization of such identities erupted at another historical juncture, the neoliberal turn, that prompted divergent trajectories for sexual and gender minorities. These involved a radicalization of the gay rights movement by the dawn of the 1980s and the commercialization of a homonormative gay scene that became representative of a supposed unified LGBT identity. Homonormativity, as Duggan asserts, is an order of norms that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions but upholds and sustains them. As Drucker argues, the neoliberal turn's de-radicalization of the movement and increasing commercialization of spaces was symptomatic of the co-optation by the hegemonic homonormative gay men and women of the upper middle class core. These members of the visible LGBT community have not only weathered neoliberal processes of austerity, but have thrived under them. Thus, more radical concerns of the queer movement of the 60s and 70s transformed to reflect homonormative aspirations of the modern movement, including civil and political legitimation such as marriage equality, without addressing racist and economic insecurity that persists even in the West today. This co-optation and neoliberalization of LGBT identity has left neglected the effects of economic restructurings upon queer persons of color, of the working poor, and within the periphery, and what Drucker calls the fractionalization of LGBT identities. This occurs not only within the West as social provisions have been cut, but also within peripheral countries where austerity measures and the infiltration of international financial institutions have adversely affected such societies. This can be read as a growing gulf between the fates of homonormative gays and the illegible queer masses, where political gains labeled equality belie any concerns for racial or economic justice. In many places, such as that of Jamaica, economic injustices are compounded by the persistence and intensification of anti-sodomy laws. So this brings me to the case of Gully Queens and structural escape. I argue by utilizing Grubo-Check and Ahern's conceptions of exilic space and structural escape that the Gully Queens have utilized their marginality to recreate a community operating and existing despite the rampant commodification of state space in the neoliberal era. As a country deeply implicated within recent reforms of structural adjustment and austerity measures, Jamaica has promoted and retrenched its position against homosexuals as resistance against supposed lax Western mores. This comes at a time when the impacts of neoliberal restructuration have taken the capacity of the state for social redistribution. The community of approximately 40 queer and transgender youths occupying the drainage system in the central business district of Kingston. The metaphor for occupying the cracks of capitalism and structural escape is made literal for the Gully Queens, as it is a subterranean community within the drainage ditch, surrounded by the monuments of capital of central Kingston, such as banks, multinational corporations, and government buildings. The initial impulses to characterize their escape as forced exile are those communities that are forced out by state capital. Indeed, their relationship with local police forces and dominant state discourse places them as dispossessed within society. Local police attribute the violence experienced by the Gully Queens as a result of their own moral failings, equating their marginalized status as homosexual and transgender individuals with perceived criminality. Yet their criminality can also be traced within local Kingston society to their substantive economy to provide for one another. As one member explains, we hustle, we have a stall or sell snacks, biscuits, weed, cigarettes, liquor, and we do sex work for a living. The Gully Queens' informal economy breaches more respectful methods of livelihood, and they're applying illegal goods and services, just as their bodies and ways of life are deviant and illegible to national discourse predicated on heterosexually respectful norms. Their means of subsistence operate outside of the realm of the formal economy and prescribed respectability. While initially viewed as a site of forced exclusion, the Gully Queen occupation can also be read as voluntary escape by its persistence. Their recreation of community is one of a queer family, with senior respected members of the community becoming mothers, along with daughters, sisters, and so forth, each with their own obligations and responsibilities for other members. These include, of course, material support, emotional care, and protection from violent outsiders. And newer members of the community become implicated or informed through training within the subsistence economy by learning how to hustle, and there's often public festivals of togetherness together within the Gully itself with dancing and loud music. These obligations then represent not only ensuring individual survival, but the survival of the group as a whole through collective participation. While the gully are the public other of Jamaican homosexual behavior in Jamaican discourse, they are by no means the totality of the Jamaican queer community. There exists a homonormative layer of publicly closeted gay and lesbian individuals who exist in relative safety compared to the persecution of victims face. The divide between such homonormative persons in the gullies is palpable, as Jamaican lawyer Royce explains. We have classism in Jamaica, so we have what is called the rich queens and the scary queens. The rich queens are the gay men or Sunnis like myself, and we can insulate ourselves from the worst forms of homophobia. So we have this tendency of thinking of the poor queens or scary queens, as being at fault for having this homophobia meted out against them. If they would just be more like us, they'd be safe. And if you're in a persecuted class, as we are, if you manage to escape your persecution, you don't want to bring any taint of that. This is an example is telling of Drucker's argument of the differential trajectories of homonormative and non-homonormative individuals under neoliberal capitalism. While the rich queens benefit and are able to thrive in relative peace under the neoliberal order, the gully queens as a queer subculture are fractionalized and divergent from this experience. Yet their displacement under neoliberalism is not restricted just to the queer identity. The gully community is also a community of displaced youths, operating on the marginal side of the tension between threat and promise. As Komaroff and Komaroff argue, the more danger-loaded terms of youth and delinquent take on particular race, class, and ethnic dimensions. The gully queens as deviant youth become a menace and a threat to the state's business as usual in the national discourse. Threatening ideals of respectability and the propagation of criminal deviance, the gullies are not contesting their condition with the state, but operate for great community and structural escape. While those homonormative LGBT persons contest the state to decriminalize homosexual behavior, the gully queens themselves act and live in defiance of harsh legal codes and are often ignored in such advocacy discourse while being demonized by anti-LGBT forces on the other side. The anti-sodomy laws in government rhetoric place the gully queens as deviant and criminal can also be read as a qgrad-conference concept of political bargaining. As the author describes, such bargaining within the state is a negotiation that can lead to relative autonomy away from the state via some obligation of the community towards the state. Their persistence as a community is reminiscent of such a bargain. For the state, the community can become a scapegoat of all society's ills and an example of the lapse of moral respectability caused by the infiltration of Western morals. Furthermore, this political bargain is in relation to the state's continued negligence in addressing the structural issues of the urban poor in general that are reflected into the cutting of social provisions of the liberal austerity measures. And I think I'll leave you there with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikey. Now, Sachi Hannah-Kelly Snelling is from New York University, and she's going to present City Branding and the Gayification of Tel Aviv, Israel.
And the research I'm presenting today is drawn from my NYU undergraduate thesis titled The Convergence of Homosexuality and National Identity in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. The subject of my presentation, Becoming a Gay City, City Branding and Gay Tourism in Tel Aviv, is drawn from the first chapter of my thesis, which discusses homosexuality in Israel and the concept of Tel Aviv as the gay capital of the Middle East. The creation of the Israeli gay brand and the transformation of Tel Aviv into a quote-unquote gay city is representative of the intersection between national identity politics and homosexuality in Israel. So the concept of place branding, of which city branding is one type, grew out of the traditional marketing strategy of applying brands to objects. Though the history of marketing extends over a century, place branding didn't become commonplace, if you will, until the 1990s. And the contemporary nature of this strategy has led to its global popularity, causing cities to compete for various identities within the international tourism realm. The principal aim of city branding is to establish the city as a popular travel destination and provide a steady, sometimes niche stream of tourism. My research centers on Israel's use of city branding, particularly gay city branding in Tel Aviv, and its subsequent effect on the international reputation and the discourse surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The gayification of Tel Aviv has resulted in an international perception of Israel as gay-friendly and when discussing homosexuality in Israel, it's important to first understand the state's current LGBTQ rights. Israel has an impressive history of LGBTQ rights, predating the United States and Western nations in some cases. Israel officially legalized same-sex sexual activity in 1988 and has steadily increased the rights of the LGBTQ community since. However, gay marriage still does not exist in Israel. Marriage in Israel is controlled by a confessional community system in which marriage as a religious institution is under the authority of whichever religious community the person belongs. And none of the 15 religious courts in Israel currently permit same-sex marriage. Though the state allows for civil unions that grant equal rights to gay couples, the lack of gay marriage represents the significant role of religion in Israeli society and policy. Apart from gay marriage, however, Israel provides equal rights to LGBTQ individuals, something which aligns them with Western nations and separates them from their Middle Eastern neighbors. In 2010, Israel began visibly using their pro-gay policies for public relations purposes, but that process actually began 5 years prior. In 2005, the Jerusalem Daily Forward published this article. Israel aims to improve its public image. The article introduced the Brand Israel Group, a volunteer coalition of 7 marketing experts, led by Ido Aharoni, the former media and public affairs consultant at the Israeli consulate in New York. The Brand Israel Group was commissioned and financed by Israel's Foreign Ministry, Finance Ministry, and the Office of the Prime Minister. The campaign was reacting to in-depth research that claimed non-Israelis struggle to relate to or even understand the people of Israel. Guido Mer, the then Deputy Director General of the Public Affairs of the Foreign Ministry, explained that the group's intention was to formulate a rebranding effort aimed at the United States and Europe. In 2005, the Brand Israel Group only established the government's interest in shifting international perception. It didn't specify a strategy or a tactic. The subject of nation rebranding was revisited in 2010 at the annual Herzliya conference, which was aimed at confronting the still present issue of Israel's primarily negative international image. The Brand Israel Group spoke and presented their plan at this conference, and Ido Aharoni was quoted in his speech saying, "Universally, Israel's DNA is about the conflict, and the context within which Israel is being perceived is all about bad news. Whether you agree with Israeli policies or not is irrelevant. Even our biggest supporters are unable to relate to us." The research conducted by the Brand Israel Group in the years between 2005 and 2010 revealed that Israelis saw themselves as modern, creative, and friendly, and their goal is to communicate this perception to the Western world. Aharoni explains strategy as, "You have to restore Israel's relevance in the world by communicating Israel's success, by identifying Israel's relative advantages, and then begin a long-term strategic celebration of those relative advantages." The conference produced a working paper titled "Winning the Battle of the Narrative, Strategic Communication for Israel." The paper agreed on the characteristics for Israel's future brand, such as building the future, vibrant diversity, and entrepreneurial zeal. The major consensus of the report was also a need to appeal to the Western European and American elites. The report stated that to create and mobilize support, one must point to convergent morals and similar values. In that sense, messages should be coupled with examples of similar compatible values of Israel with the West. Gaining the trust of members of Western elites and thus strengthening their association with Israel can influence Israel's image very favorably. So in conclusion, by 2010, Israel was committed to recasting its international identity in a manner that steered away from the conflict, highlighted modernity, diversity, future, and appeal to Western liberals. And first signs of gay branding in Tel Aviv came that same year. So the Brand Israel Project and Herzliya Conference showed that the decision to rebrand came prior to the decision to rebrand using a gay identity. My research revealed that the gay identity was chosen because it aligned with the aforementioned characteristics, liberal, modern, diverse, and appealed to Western elites. Another factor I came across was the concept of homosexuals as a preferred minority. In Pink Tourism, Howard Hughes discusses this Western gay archetype. homosexual archetype of describing him as male, white, wealthy, educated, and quite significantly prone to attract other segments of society, such as youth or liberal Westerners. By keeping this archetype in their gay city branding, Israel is largely appealing to the affluent LGBTQ demographic and its allies in the Western world, despite this not being an accurate portrayal of the LGBT community in Israel or the Western world. The largest LGBTQ organization in Israel is the Aguda. Its spokesman, Shai Deutsch, has confirmed in interviews that the gay identity was selected for Tel Aviv because it would lead to non-gay tourism as well. He was quoted saying, Tel Aviv's image was previously known for bombing, military, and people in uniform. When people realize that Tel Aviv is so open-minded, it can't be that scary, and automatically it is becoming free, safe, very tolerant, very open-minded. And it brought us a lot of other types of tourists. The Deputy Director of Marketing at the Ministry of Tourism, Pini Shani, was also quoted saying that the gay branding of Tel Aviv changed the identity of the city from a religious destination to an ethnic destination. Evident a decision to distance religion from the Tel Aviv brand, which also suggests a distance of Tel Aviv from the rest of Israel, especially Jerusalem, whose identity is very religious. Despite this disparity, campaigns promoting gay tourism intended to depict Israel as a whole as pro-gay and accepting, suggesting that it is as liberal as gay-friendly secular Tel Aviv. The actual transformation of Tel Aviv into a gay city began in 2010 with the Tel Aviv Gay Pride campaign aimed at Western Europe and USA. A wider range of pro-Israel organization based in San Francisco described this campaign as a collaboration between Israel's Ministry of Tourism, the Tel Aviv Tourism Board, and Israel's permanent LGBTQ institution, the Aguda, to fulfill the city's promise as the world's newest gay capital. Gay Pride used social media, foreign magazines, international LGBTQ events, phone apps, to promote Tel Aviv as a tourist attraction for gay tourists. These physical advertisements and materials encourage connection between the gay tourist and the city of Tel Aviv, eventually creating a cycle in which tourists come to Israel because of its tolerant pro-gay image. The transition from the word Tel Aviv to Israel was evident in these marketing efforts. The campaign began by marketing Tel Aviv as a gay city, but because of the resulting reputation of Israel as a gay-friendly destination, advertisements like the ones shown in the slideshow discuss Israel in general as a gay destination, drawing especially on their LGBTQ laws and the lack thereof in surrounding nations. Success of the rebranding efforts in the Gay Pride campaign was evident in 2012 when Tel Aviv was voted the world's best gay city of gay travel destination. This campaign succeeded in increasing tourism from gay and non-gay segments, especially from the West, and improving Israel's international identity, changing the conversation from one based on the conflict to one on tolerance, fun, and identity. While the Brand Israel Group and Gay Pride campaign argued that the purpose of rebranding Tel Aviv was to improve tourism, support the gay community, and share Israel's actual positive liberal identity with international, primarily Western society, an alternate interpretation of this mission branding arose in 2010 through accusations of pinkwashing. This trend started in 2010 New York Times article written by Sarah Schulman titled Israel and Pinkwashing. Pinkwashing is defined as the promotion of pro-gay policies as a means of distracting from other human rights abuses. The concept predates its application in Israel, but in the past 6 years it has often been used in reference to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A discourse began in which certain scholars, allies, and activists have accused Israel as the Israeli government, foreign ministry, independent institutions, including non-Israeli pro-Israel organizations such as American-based Stand With Us and the Wider Bridge, of pinkwashing, arguing that Israel is using its LGBTQ rights and Tel Aviv's identity and the perception that that identity extends to all of Israel to distract from continued occupation and other human rights abuses related to the conflict. The pro-Israel advertisements in the slideshow exemplify Israel's inclusion of Palestinians in their pro-gay narrative, claiming both that Palestinian society is homophobic and that gay Palestinians consider Israel to be paradise. These advertisements are contradicted by Israel's refusal to extend asylum to gay Palestinian refugees and the fact that in 2014, an Israeli Inter-Office Committee made up of these same ministries that commissioned the Brand Israel Group produced an official ruling that homosexuals do not face persecution in the Palestinian territories, a ruling that's been criticized and contested. discussing Israel's appropriate identity, the perspective of the Israeli government, tourism industry is often highlighted, as well as the public accusers of pinkwashing, often ones outside of Israel. One group that receives actually less attention in this conversation is that of Israel's own LGBTQ community. Considering that gay city branding and especially pinkwashing can be contentious subjects, last January, through a research grant, I traveled to Israel with the hope of gaining insight into the Israeli LGBTQ community's view on pinkwashing accusations and homosexuality's place in Israel's national identity, and if it is welcomed outside of Tel Aviv. One of the individuals I interviewed was a representative from the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance, Eli Switkowski, who offered insight into the LGBT community there. He's explained that the community in Jerusalem faces homophobia and a common sentiment that they should not publicize their homosexuality, as it is, homosexuality is certainly not a part of Jerusalem's brand. Eli stated that our government tends to portray Israel as an LGBTQ haven in the Middle East, which it is obviously not. He admitted to believing that the Israeli government practices pinkwashing, which he called dangerous, since it does not, and I quote, concern itself with the actual issues facing the LGBTQ community in Israel, pretending instead that said problems don't exist. He raised an interesting point, an interesting dilemma, that said because Israel publicly markets itself as a gay-friendly destination or a paradise for LGBTQ people in the Middle East, it no longer focuses or likes to acknowledge the shortcomings in its actual support for the community or the ongoing problems. Eli explained that just because the laws were almost equal does not mean that homophobia, discrimination, and inequality did not exist. This slide displays two surveys from 2013 on the subject of homosexuality in Israel. The first was conducted by the Pew Research Center, titled The Global Divide on Homosexuality. It surveyed 39 countries on whether or not society should accept homosexuality, and in Israel, 47% responded no, while only 40% responded yes. The second survey was found in the Israeli Democracy Index questionnaire entitled It Would Bother Me to Have as a Neighbor. Regarding homosexuals, results indicate not only that the ultra-Orthodox and religious communities are largely against it, but also 28% of the traditional non-religious communities and 17.6% of the secular community. These polls are especially telling since they came a year after Tel Aviv was voted the world's best gay city, even though it displays that at that time the majority of the population believed that society shouldn't accept homosexuality. These statistics and my conversation with Eli suggest that while Israel has succeeded in providing near equal rights to its LGBTQ citizens and has created in Tel Aviv a fiscally beneficial safe haven for gay Israelis, homophobia remains present throughout both their highly religious communities and even some of the secular demographic. And while Tel Aviv may accept homosexuality in the Western world, it is now likely to acknowledge Tel Aviv and Israel's pro-gay identity. Much of Israel does not provide that same acceptance to its homosexual citizens. And I finished this thesis in May, but I've been following events since then. There's two I wanted to point out from this last Pride, which reflect the persistence of a status quo in which homosexuality is accepted in Tel Aviv and yet largely religiously driven intolerance persists elsewhere in Israel. There's a gay pride parade in the Israeli city of Beersheba this year, resulted in a public controversy. Police officials rescinded their previously granted permission to have the gay pride parade on the city's main road, following threats. They said it was partly for the safety of the participants, but also because the event may deeply hurt religious sentiments of the local community. The Israeli High Court of Justice reviewed the decision and supported the police, and the parade was not allowed because of homophobic opposition. The Beersheba Pride organizers decided to cancel the parade, holding the parade somewhere else, and instead hold a demonstration in its place, which over 2,000 attendees came to protest the discriminatory decision. Conversely, Tel Aviv's 18th annual Pride this year drew 200,000 participants, which is the largest in history, and their theme was Women for a Change, and it focused on empowering women in the LGBTQ community. So these two very different experiences with 2016 Pride in Beersheba and Tel Aviv confirm that Israel has only partially accepted homosexuality into its national identity through legal means in the Tel Aviv brand, but homophobia and discrimination persist throughout much of the country. That's it.
Thank you very much. Our next and last speaker will be Jobin Philip from Royce University, and his talk is entitled Surviving in the Sanctuary, Queer Refugees, Use of Discretion Post-Migration.
So my name is Jobin Philip. I'm a recent graduate from the MA program in Immigration and Settlement Studies from Royce University in Toronto. So my graduate research started off as an exploration of queer migration into a safe haven that was initially thought perceived to be heteronormative. So that was sort of where I started off with my MA thesis research. But over time, and especially after the contributions of my queer refugee participants, as well as my key informant, the intersection of race and sexuality became much more pronounced in my research findings and in the direction of the paper. So in the end, my research looked at the ways in which the intersectionality of race, queer sexuality, and queer identity, as well as status, impacted the social construction of racialized and queer refugees as both racialized risks and queer threats in a haven that is both securitized and heteronormative. And how being constructed as a risky subject influences their decisions to carry out their queer expression and their queer engagement on the down low, discreetly. So my conference paper is entitled Surviving in Sanctuary, Queer Refugees' Use of Discretion Post-Migration. I remember this whole discourse about, our gay culture. But what is gay culture, and what fashioned that culture? What oppression fashioned this notion that gay men should have multiple anonymous partners without attachment? What fashioned that? What oppression and social forces fashioned that notion, and why should I buy into it? Is sexual exclusivity a heteronormative tradition? This was a quote from my MA thesis research, in which the key informant Amber questioned the notion of a dominant gay culture. Theorists such as Dugan have examined the notion of homonormativity, and in which the social construction of gayness is associated with white, affluent, and male bodies. During this past summer, there were many incidences of violence that were aimed towards queer and racialized folks, including the Orlando massacre that resulted in the murders of queer and Latinx folks, as well as the continued killings of trans women of color both here in the West and in the East. The intersectionality that race has with queer identity in these instances of heteronormative violence is oftentimes overlooked in the media narratives surrounding these events. Oftentimes, it is the homonormative bodies that represent queer communities in the public sphere of society. As we continue to see the promotion of white LGBTQ identities in public spaces, racial politics of exclusion can simultaneously marginalize queer communities of color. These politics shape the instances of violence that non-homonormative queer folks face, including those who are women, trans, or racialized. This larger social force of homonormativity also has a direct impact on the experiences of resettlement for queer and racialized refugees. More specifically, the decisions that these particular migrants make regarding public queer expression, as well as the perceived choices that they have for their resettled lives in Toronto, Ontario. It was Bell Hooks who said, I believe, who said that oppression is the absence of choices. And so that's a big factor in this research, is that if queer refugees are choosing to be discreet, it can be empowering if they feel like that's their expression, if they feel that that's an expression of their free will or agency, but it's the absence of choices and feeling like it's their only option that it becomes an oppressive experience. This conference paper seeks to argue that racialized and queer refugees are oftentimes relegated to the underground scene of the down low post-migration, which could have both positive and detrimental effects for their resettled lives. Discrete queer expression can be positive in the sense that one can discover their own nuanced spaces for queer engagement, but it can also be detrimental as living so privately can lead to self-segregation, isolation, and challenges with mental health. A theoretical lens that's critical of hegemonic whiteness was used as one of two theoretical frameworks in my thesis study and can support in the critique of this homonormative culture that aims to confine public queer expression to certain places and for particular bodies. My MA study examined the double threat that queer refugees can pose in a heteronormative destination country due to their deviant sexuality and refugee status, which can position them further on the margins of society. Refugees who are queer and racialized may turn to discretion as a tool for survival in their home countries due to the religious culture that exists there. However, even if they migrate into a different geographical space, they may still feel the need to be discreet out of the need for survival. My research study drew in participants from the Caribbean and Ukraine, as well as a key informant who originated from Tanzania and currently works as a refugee lawyer in Toronto, Ontario. Although the recruitment standards were open to refugees of all queer identities, the participants in my study each identified as a cisgender gay male. The three participants in my study shared their experiences of living their queer lives on the down low. The down low, also known as the DL, is an underground scene in which queer bodies may compartmentalize their same-sex relations or non-conforming gender expression to private spaces. Being on the down low is not the same as being closeted, as there may be no intention of revealing one's queer self at any point in time. For queer refugees, discretion can lead to survival, but can also create barriers in the resettlement process. For example, one participant named Shane, he felt discriminated against in the heteronormative space of the Immigration and Refugee Board, as his discretion was interpreted by one professional as being deceitful. Shane felt as though the immigration official lacked a larger context for why he had to lie in the Caribbean, and consequently he faced challenges in obtaining a successful refugee claim. Living discreetly can pose challenges in achieving a successful claim, as you are expected to provide visible evidence of your membership in a persecuted group. Providing such evidence to an immigration official, however, can be a difficult process for the queer refugee claimant. For example, participant Steve expressed the discomfort that he felt when asked about his past intimate encounters in the previous country. Sharing past experiences of persecution so early on in the resettlement process can lead to re-traumatization, as well as a worsening of pre-existing mental health issues. This demonstrates that the migration to a more progressive country like Canada does not guarantee a personal sense of safety. Another participant, Ron, shared his experiences of being discreet and emphasized the unstable support that one can receive while selectively sharing their queer self with others on the down low. The possibility of being exposed by a scorned lover or a hurt friend is always present. This constant self-surveillance, whether in public or private spaces, can lead to ongoing mental health issues in the new country. Foucault brought forth the idea that visibility is a trap, and in the source countries for participants, exposure led to death threats and persecution from loved ones. Living on the down low was meant to be a necessary tool for survival for my participants rather than a desirable choice. The down low does not only exist in foreign geographical spaces beyond the West. Discrete queer folks are located all over the world, including North America. Toronto, Ontario has a reputation for being both a gay-friendly and sanctuary city. It is the perfect Canadian destination for queer refugees to resettle into due to the services and gay spaces that it offers. Gay spaces, such as bars and pubs, can serve as a heterotropic escape from the heteronormative world. However, these spaces may still promote the racial tensions that exist between the queer folks who are racialized and the ones who are not. As heteronormativity enforces the processes of normalization that aim to suppress visible queer expression and promote heterosexual ways of life, homonormativity creates a bridge for white gay bodies to enter into the public sphere. This bridge does not exist for many queer people of color, who often resort to their own methods of finding and possibly constructing their own spaces to express their socially deviant desires. The choice to pursue private or discreet queer expression does not have to be a simply oppressive experience. Being on the down low can also present an opportunity for more nuanced forms of sexual expression that do not rely on the support or do not rely solely on the support of homonormative communities. The presence of racialized folks in a multicultural city such as Toronto is a result of the processes of migration that have occurred over decades. Despite the racial tensions that may exist in Toronto's neighborhood, which is known as the Village, participants in my study were able to find a truly welcoming space within the refugee settlement group that operates out of the 519 Community Center. This community center is the main hub for LGBTQ communities in the city of Toronto and continues to provide a space for queer refugee claimants to find supportive people. These people may also belong to their diasporic or ethnic communities. Whereas participant Ron actively avoided his ethnic community post-migration due to the possibility of transnational gossip traveling back to the Caribbean, participant Shane found other queer folks in his queer diaspora while volunteering at the 519. Racialized and queer refugees do not simply face marginalization from the white and homonormative bodies, but also face homophobic attitudes within their ethnic communities. Post-migration, Ron had learned about a man in his ethnic community who operated as a taxi driver in Toronto. This taxi driver always tried to avoid driving down Church Street as he did not want to be seen in the gay village, even if he was just driving through with his taxi cab. This is an example of how deeply rooted, homophobic, and heteronormative discourses can be within ethnic communities, which adds to the multiple pressures that cause queer and racialized refugees to exercise constant and rigorous self-discipline all throughout the migration process. In his work, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Foucault demonstrated that it is the public scandal that is associated with coming out that causes homophobic violence and societal punishment, as evident in the story of the two campers. These two male campers, who were in love with each other, were safe from their peers' harassment until they revealed themselves to them. Intersectionality was a major concept in my research, as the multiple identities held by each of my participants further positioned them on the margins of society, where they felt as though they had to hide their displays of queer affection, even in a city such as Toronto. This is not simply because heteronormativity and homonormativity grant public visibility to white, affluent, and male bodies. The choice to be discreet and live on the down low post-migration may also be due to the fact that queer and racialized refugees have the drive to be resilient and persevere, and may choose to keep their head down as they work hard to resettle into the source country. Some queer refugees may gradually experience newfound empowerment after they resettle. For example, Amber described one of his clients who called the police on someone after they came to Canada, despite the victimization that they had experienced by law officials in the previous country. Participant Ron also discovered his own agency through his processes of migration and the ability that he had to turn away from men who could possibly pull him back to the down low. Participant Shane felt inspired after experiencing the Toronto Pride Parade and meeting same-sex couples post-migration, which led to a renewed sense of hope for his own future and a decrease in mental and emotional burnout. My research study concludes with the fact that my queer refugee participants overall found that migrating to Toronto was the right decision for them to make, as it presented possibilities for public engagement or queer expression without the threat of state-sanctioned persecution or violence. But in order to enjoy the benefits of their migration to Toronto, they had to do two things. First, they had to earn refugee status, there are barriers to earning that status, but the status grants the work permit, which then grants access to employment. And then second, they also had to overcome the personal and social barriers to finding a sense of community or connection with other queer folks. Those social barriers include the racial politics that exist in queer communities, which are influenced by heteronormativity and homonormativity. The privilege that is bestowed to homonormative bodies through the construction of gay identity as inherently white has more to do with better access to visibility, resources for support, and not a lack of suffering. Queer communities still struggle to acknowledge that there are race-based politics and larger power relations that govern public expression for racialized bodies, and also confine some LGBTQ refugees to the unsafe space of the down low. A sanctuary should ideally allow someone to thrive and not just survive. As I finished my MA program, I'm aiming to pursue further graduate studies. Currently, I would like to build up this research and further explore the theories of queer diaspora and queer world making, and more specifically looking at that question of do racialized and queer folks really need to fit within this larger visible community in order to feel empowerment or that validation, or are we just as well as constructing our own intimate environments of like finding that tribe, that queer tribe? Yeah.
Thank you very much, all of you, for 3 very dense talks. I realized that I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Laure Murat, and I'm a professor in the French and Francophone Studies Department. I'm also the director of the Center for European and Russian Studies and a proud member of the Faculty Advisory Board of the LGBTQ program. So it's time to open the conversation, questions. Yes?
I forgot your name. Is it Philip?
Jobin.
Jobin.
Have you read Leonette Cantu's work?
Whose part?
Leonette Cantu's work.
Oh, no, I haven't.
He's a sociologist. He did work on Mexican men and migration. I think maybe his framework might be useful.
Okay.
Just because, if I'm trying to remember correctly, and maybe somebody in the room might know his work a little bit more, whose areas of expertise is migration. He very much inherently critiques basically white supremacy in his work, and that there's like this myth of bodies of color inherently being homophobic.
Yeah.
And that there's, in some cases, like to be quote unquote closeted or down low is actually a reflection of being under a racist nation state.
Yeah.
And so that, I don't know, I'm trying to remember it, but it might be useful.
Okay. What was the, how do you spell the last name?
Lionel, Lionel, and then Cantu, C-A-U-N-T-U with the accent mark on the U.
Okay.
Yes?
So I have a question for Sachi. Yeah, I don't know if that's right.
Sachi.
Sachi.
Oh.
So when you were in Tel Aviv, I was wondering, Israel, if you like interviewed any tourists, I guess LGBT tourists, to see their perceptions on whether or not they face the persecution or homophobia that some of like the residents felt.
Does this work? Yeah. I mean, I think they can. Well, I actually didn't. That would have been a good idea. I was only there for a couple days, but so I spoke with the Eli in Jerusalem, and I was trying to get a couple different perspectives from the Palestinian organizations, and then a lawyer. But that actually is a good idea. I know that in Tel Aviv, from the reports I've read from tourists, I haven't come across anybody facing any
kind of homophobia. I'm sure there may have been instances, but there's a lot on record of how welcoming and gay-friendly and familiar it all is. But in Jerusalem, that'd be an interesting.
Yes?
I have a question for Mikey.
Yeah.
For Mikey, so I'm from Jamaica, and I think like I've been reflecting a lot about positionality of the Gully Queen, and like so one of the questions is how people like what's his name, Maurice Tomlinson is his name, right? Maurice is like how like this idea of the rich queens are using the representation of the Gully Queens kind of this form of push back against homophobia in the country and also to push back against particular laws that do not grant full citizenship to queer folk in Jamaica. So I think this idea of like, oh, Jamaica is the most homophobic country in the world, look at the Gully Queens, like this is like a trope to kind of push back against that.
Right, so you're talking about how these kind of homonormative, if you would say,
I think like particularly like folks who come to the U.S. and to North America and then try to change policy in Jamaica from a more Western U.S.-centric framework. How they're if you notice people using the representation of the Gully Queens in that.
Yeah, I mean, the publicity of the Gully Queens themselves has been prolific, and I don't think it's not without the efforts of the J-Flag, for example, the Jamaican, main Jamaican LGBT group there. It's kind of a counter discourse for them because I guess the Gully Queens are so visible as far as government representation of like, you know, this is kind of like the germ in our society that's like infecting the rest of us. This is why there's poverty. This is why, you know, so much of these violences are happening. But yeah, I think that, they kind of use them as well as a trope to kind of further their own benefit. And I think the publicity, such as the Vice interview, for example, is kind of used to garner international attention, international framing of this cause. And I mean, this has been used in a lot of cases, particularly in the Middle East itself, with Joseph Massad's Desiring Arabs, this concept of the gay international that kind of uses communities or accounts or anecdotal accounts of these kind of communities and violences that are being perpetrated against them to kind of further like a very Western-centric, Eurocentric vision of what queer is or what LGBT itself, where possibly like these kind of labels and these kinds of epistemologies or ontologies aren't necessarily comparable to the realities on the ground. I mean, it's very much common. You can also see it in the case of the Middle East and the pinkwashing, of course, as well. I mean, where there's kind of this counterposition between like a religious extremism, or we can say Jamaican religious extremism, or this kind of national being with countering, you know, the bodies of supposed LGBT or queer peoples. Yeah, I think it's common. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
I guess the other question I just wanted to ask is in doing the research, because I'm really thinking about how to center understandings of queerness, even like the word queer.
Right.
How to move away from that and think about a Caribbean-centered understanding of queerness, and particularly thinking about epistemologies and language. And I guess I wonder in your research if you found a reclamation of particular terms or like a way of discussing being queer in a Caribbean-centered framework as opposed to re-articulating U.S.-centric.
Right. Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff I've come across in regards to these kinds of questions is coming from literary critique or comparative literature, more so than like sociological studies. Jonathan Goldberg, he has a good kind of short little book. It's called The Tempest in the Caribbean, and he's kind of collecting a lot of these colonial and post-colonial thinkers, particularly from the Caribbean, but more specifically Cuba and Jamaica. And he's talking about how these kinds of negotiations between masculinity and femininity, memories of, you know, the Atlantic slave trade, plantation kind of mentalities come about. And he's integrating like kind of like a genealogy of sort of literature of sorts of like kind of these independence era movements in the Caribbean towards present day from like the 80s and 90s of what it means to be, you know, how queerness itself becomes historically racialized within these contexts. Another person I would suggest is Sylvia Winter. She's a a lot of the stuff that she works on with like racialization and monster theories is really, really good. It's still something I'm trying to tackle, the question itself. We'll see how it comes about. It's kind of like the triangulating between, comparative literature, sociology, and like other kinds of theory. It's different, yeah.
Alicia?
Yeah, first I congratulate you all for 3 really, as you were saying, dense papers. And I really appreciate, expanding the conversation outside of the borders of the U.S. I mean, that's really, really important. But I wanted to talk about methodology a little bit, because other than Jobin, whose topic and methods are directly related to the field that you're in, both Stachi and Mikey are in fields that are not typically, versed in queer theory or queer methods. So if you would talk about, what kind of training you're getting or you're giving yourself, basically, to do this kind of analysis, because I know that there are no LGBTQ PhD programs yet. We're going to develop the first one here at UCLA. Sorry, I had to make a commercial for that. But this question of training in method and theory is very important, because you don't necessarily get it in Middle Eastern studies or what's your field again?
Sociology.
Sociology. So then taking what you're learning in your field and then having to, tweak it and then apply other methods. If you would talk about how you collected your information and especially what you used to analyze it.
Well, it was kind of an interesting experience for me, because as you say, like, my field is more Middle Eastern study than queer theory. And I came upon this subject, I spent a summer in Israel, and I was kind of fascinated by the juxtaposition of the identity of Tel Aviv versus the experience for the queer Palestinian and the queer Palestinian refugee and the queer Arab Israeli and then the ultra religious communities. And so all of this, I kind of saw this thread of looking through at the conflict through how they handle national identity and the LGBTQ community. So I was using sort of this as a lens to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I guess it was interesting to, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question, but just through really kind of going, actual interviews, actually really looking into each of these communities, but then using it as a lens for Middle Eastern theory. I guess that's how I did it. I don't really know how else to.
Yeah, well, you're kind of crafting your own method there.
Yeah, it was. It came together.
Yeah, because there's also a lot of individuals that I was looking at. There's also a lot of advertising and publicity type of imagery. And then so that adds a whole other level of discourse.
Yeah, I couldn't really apply one theory to the whole thing. I had to look at each of my chapters was a different segment of this thing all weaved together through identity, homosexuality, and the conflict. Right. And I really had to address each one straight on, kind of with the facts and the theory that applied to that. Are you
going to expand that into your dissertation?
For my master's?
For your PhD that you're going to do.
Oh, maybe. Maybe. Next time I'll ask the tourists. So.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, when I say sociology, Binghamton's program has been renowned for not really being insiderism as far as sociology goes. It's a lot of world historical and political economy stuff. So I'm informed a lot by that more recently, but I've been in interdisciplinary programs with international studies as well. My master's was in planning, and I had certificates in history as well. I think this paper particularly is coming out of kind of the struggles I've had in my own department now. In kind of understanding how we can talk about even an economic history, and I tend to do more historical sociology. This is kind of the cause, not cause and effect, but kind of the continuation of a lot of the work that I've been working on. But just how can we talk about identities themselves and kind of these paradigms that identities really don't get that much play in. And that's where I've been kind of looking towards Dugan, that both of us mentioned, and Peter Drucker in particular, that kind of looks at how queer as an identity, as a practice that's being performed, is also kind of situated within these political economic regimes that also are intersecting with race, gender, of course. And I mean, I think he's kind of been the key for me most recently in the earlier part of my PhD program of kind of connecting these two sides of myself in a way of kind of looking at how, you know, queerness or even LGBT identity is kind of experienced, lived, and performed, and also kind of the inequalities, the very real structural inequalities that are kind of going along with these processes. I mean, if we're just going to talk about the uneven impacts of legislations across the globe, like from the global north to the south and everything, I mean, you can't kind of just pull these people, these groups of people away from, or us away from these kind of complicities. So I think it's really important. Yeah. I don't know if I answered. Yeah, okay.
It strikes me in the three talks that each of you talked about heteronormativity and homonormativity, and there is a very narrow space between the two for queer lives. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. When you think about queer nation, for instance, and now what your conclusion said about being discreet and private is better, and down low. So from queer nation to down low, what's happening basically about queer politics?
Yeah.
So in these three very different parts of the world, right? So that would be my first question. The second one is the other thing that was striking, and I always have a problem in English because of that, because gay means everything, but also only male. Okay, mm-hmm. So sometimes you say gay, sometimes you say LGBTQ, etc., etc. But massively, your three talks were about male. In the photos, they were only male, not a woman. So what about lesbians, basically?
That's a good question.
Me? Well, that's sort of what I touched on when I said the Howard Hughes is like gay male archetype, or this Western white affluent male, as being, at least from a marketing decision, I guess,
yes,
for a more like the better decision. I guess they were saying that there's less of a understood lesbian community there, and it was easier to connect with that. In the years since that Israel has gained this reputation, and as I was saying, the Pride Parade this year, the theme was Women for a Change, but I think that's representative of how male-dominated kind of the image of the gay community is. But
because for the army, for instance, it's very interesting because you have so many lesbians in the Israeli army. So.
Yeah, but yeah, they do often choose male for the images and for the advertisement because they believe it's more successful and attracts.
That is not heteronormativity or homonormativity, it's normativity.
Yeah. And it played into the concept of the preferred minority for the homosexual, but that really is largely male and often Western and white.
Even Jobin, in your bullet points, homonormativity was male, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I think as we have, like, when we normalize a particular idea, so if homonormativity is more male-oriented, our ideas of what is normal depends on defining against something else, and those who are defined outside of these normal conceptions of, like, homosexuality or gay identity, I think face they become invisible, and so do their experiences of oppression and violence. I remember reading an article by Jenny Milbank, Imagining Otherness, and in the home country for queer women, there really was no, whether it was public space or private space, these are both male-dominated spaces, and so there really was, and surveillance, if they were engaging in women-to-women interactions, there was really no safety or sense of, like, protection, because the neighborhood surveillance would catch them if they were in private spaces, police would catch them in public spaces, so I think there definitely needs to be more literature. I was kind of upset when I didn't have any, in a way, because a lot of my participants were males, and I kind of aimed to have, like, a variety of experiences, but that's just how it happened out. But yeah, definitely I think more representation needs to be done for that.
Do you have statistics about, I mean, in the work you've done?
I wanted to, coming into the, starting off with my my major research paper, what I wanted to originally do was qualitative interviews and government statistics, but the challenge of getting statistics was that many queer refugees didn't identify in service and data collection, so that queer identity component. Maybe we can get data on women, female refugees more easily, but the idea of coming out and acknowledging a queer sexuality in addition to your gender identity, I had a hard time finding LGBTQ stats. I wanted to, but so when I couldn't get that, I substituted it for a demographic survey just to get some supplemental information to contextualize findings.
I mean, in my case, of course, it's there are no, I guess, what you would say, self-identified cisgender lesbians that I'm looking at, but I'm also kind of, I can see a few strands in the history of Jamaica and the Caribbean and even North America itself of kind of state laws that are kind of shaping what is permissible or what should be mentioned and what should be abhorred and what should just be ignored. The anti-buggery law that's been recently contested by the JFLAG organization. I mean, it's been a continuation since 1861 of the Indian Penal Code, which actually spread across all English colonial possessions in the West that outlawed, sodomic practices between men. So the discussion is always between men, while women are not figured, and even into the wordings of the law today, women are not figured into these kinds of issues of sexuality. Also, again, going back to literary criticism kind of stuff, I've been looking at kind of these critiques of a lot of Caribbean nationalist thinkers, like critiques about Fanon, about Aimé Césaire, going off of this kind of eschewing in like the verbiage of with femininity in men, like to be a revolutionary is to be masculinist, and this is not only in like Caribbean discourse or post-colonial discourse, but this is also in like Marxist discourse of class struggle as well. I mean, you're never supposed to see a man as being feminized because the revolutionary is strong, it's vigorous. And I've also, and this is also the case with the kind of fracturing of the modern gay rights movement itself in the US. There was the Gay Liberation Front, which lasted for some time, but there was a very heavy-handed self-policing concepts of masculinity in order to have radicalism move forward. So there was a policing of the effeminate, of the androgynous or non-cis kinds of situations in promoting kind of a queer politics that was, more leftist rather than liberal in scope. And I think, a lot of these kind of literatures have been informed by this idea of radicalism and masculinism and, nationalism. I think they're all floating around while the feminine or the weak is seen as, something to go beyond. And that's what I got.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments, complaints? Okay, so it's time to eat, probably. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our presenters, and yes, lunch will be served in 306 in the balcony. Make sure you have your red tickets to get your lunch. Thank you.
Can you announce for next journal if they want to get?
Okay, we have our first volume 1 journal, which is from the presenters of qgrad in 2014. And it's now being published, and you can see the work, and we'll be having copies of it.
Yeah, and the work for this conference will be published in volume 3, right?
Yes, and the presenters would like that.